So this paper is part of a special issue of the journal Anthropological, which is coming out next month, I hope, on anthropological perspectives on the pandemic. And the paper was partly inspired by not being able to do research that I had planned on doing this summer. It seems like this is a common theme across some of the presentations in the series of people having to radically change research they're doing because of the pandemic. So I planned on doing research on financialization and cash transfer programs. That became impossible, but as the pandemic unfolded, it became very clear how important these cash transfer programs were, not only in Southern Africa, but globally as one of the dominant welfare responses to the pandemic. So the piece has two broad goals. The first is to think about how the rapid expansion of the welfare state on a global scale has opened up spaces for certain political claims and mobilizations. And the second is to think more broadly about the meaning of cash transfers, specifically for critical social researchers. So it's an exploratory piece that I hope can generate some conversations about the future of social protection policy and how different groups have responded to this. So I wrote the piece in July, and so the numbers will be a bit dated by now, but at that time, the ILO had estimated that the pandemic would result in 400 million full-time job losses, or a 15% decline in total global working hours. I think it's closer to 500 million now. States responded to this in a variety of ways, from wage subsidies to food aid to lowering interest rates, but the most common has been direct cash transfers. So the World Bank has done a really good job in tracking these responses, and their reports show that 190 countries introduced or adapted social protection measures in response to the pandemic. So almost every country on Earth, with cash transfers being the most popular intervention. The size of these transfers has been quite significant. On average, they amount to 25% of monthly GDP per capita, with lower income countries registering the most significant increases. And what's even more remarkable is that 57% of these cash transfer programs are entirely new programs. Now, anyone who's worked in government or policy knows that any type of program typically takes a very long time to design, to roll out, to implement, but many of these take a matter of weeks or months to be rolled out. They take a variety of forms and include different actors. So we have, for example, in the US, the CARES Act, where 12 million people receive a stimulus check. But you also have more direct forms of support. So in Egypt, for example, the state provides cash transfers to specific sectors, fishing, construction, and agriculture. The use of cash transfers in a context of livelihood shocks is not new, but what's really remarkable is the scale and speed at which they're rolled out. So what I do in the article is think about what this rapid expansion of the welfare state means politically, and perhaps how we can use it to rethink conventional approaches to labor livelihoods and social protection. And I do this by comparing Canada and South Africa, two cases that I'm personally familiar with. And while they both have very different welfare state histories, I was struck by how state responses in both contexts generated similar political demands among unions, social movements, political parties, and so on. Because of this, I argue that these interventions cannot be thought of just as technocratic policy responses to the pandemic. They're also very much forms of governmentality, so new ways of thinking about poverty and livelihoods. And these moves from above also generate contestations from below that can either legitimize or challenge state authority. So the piece is framed by the anthropologist James Ferguson's concept of distributional politics, which he develops through a study of cash transfer programs in Southern Africa. So his book is Give a Man a Fish, Reflections on the New Politics of Distribution, hence the title of my piece. So Ferguson argues that in an era of neoliberal governmentality, what we've also seen is a fairly dramatic expansion of welfare state spending across many parts of the global south, particularly regions like Southern Africa, where unemployment has grown rapidly and where historically there hasn't actually been a welfare state for many. So in South Africa, average unemployment is around 30%. It has been for some time. Nearly half of all households receive some direct form of cash transfer, popularly known as social grants. So as migrant labor systems collapse after the end of apartheid, cash transfers really come to replace wages as critical to the stability of households. The result of this is that cash transfers have become increasingly central to politics. So as the state becomes a direct provider, many political demands are directed toward the state. often in the form of protests around housing, electricity, education, and cash transfers. Ferguson suggests that through these programs, it's possible to trace new ways of thinking about poverty and distribution that could potentially provide the intellectual resources for an emergent politics of distribution, in effect allowing people to make a claim on national wealth. And so I'll talk a bit more about this later. So despite all the different welfare state histories, I think the pandemic revealed the clear inadequacies of existing forms of social protection in both of the country contexts. South Africa has an unemployment insurance fund, which has, over the last 30 years or so, failed to cover a growing sector of the workforce employed on a casual or temporary basis or in the informal sector. So 45% of South African workers are simply not eligible for the unemployment insurance fund. By similar labor market shifts, particularly the rapid growth of low-wage and precarious work, we have a shrinking core of workers covered by regulations, insurance, and union representation, alongside a growing cohort of workers lacking access to many of these benefits. The welfare state in Canada is clearly more expansive, but even here, employment insurance systems are still characterized by significant exclusions. So in 2018, only 33% of unemployed women and 38% of unemployed men actually receive and qualify for EI benefits. So even as there are these significant differences, both cases illustrate that social protection models are based on employment models that clearly do not correspond to the labor market realities for many workers. And the result of this is that in the pandemic, state responses were essentially to patch over many of the holes in these systems. So I don't have time to go over them in too much detail. Many of you are quite familiar with the wage subsidies in Canada, the CERB benefits, essentially rolled out to those who were not eligible for EI coverage, often due to insufficient hours of work, self-employment, and so on. The South African response involved an increase to to cash transfer rates, the creation of a new COVID grant alongside a relaxed unemployment insurance system, the delivery of food parcels, and so on. These were incredibly important interventions, but ultimately, as I'll discuss, quite insufficient. So the responses to the pandemic revealed the limitations of existing social protection systems. But what I argue in the piece is that they also provide grounds for a range of groups to make further claims upon the state. So in the piece, what I do is I identify 6 of these claims. First were calls and demands by organized labor to fix existing employment insurance systems to prevent the mass exclusions that characterized these systems in the past. And these were not new demands, these have been in both cases on the table by organized labor for some time. Second were questions about exactly who is covered by these new support programs. So many will remember that in the early stages, the CERB program came under a lot of criticism for excluding international students, temporary foreign workers, and of course, seasonal agricultural workers. South Africa is home to millions of migrants from across the continent, and yet they have always been excluded from cash transfer programs. So during the pandemic, migrant rights groups successfully brought forward a legal case to extend the COVID grant to refugees and asylum seekers. Third, in both countries, the popularity of pandemic support measures renewed calls for a basic income grant. The progressive case for this was made most clearly by the NDP in Motion 46. In South Africa, the state actually announced its intent to implement a basic income grant, even though they have not really been able to pay existing grants. And here the progressive case for a basic income was most clearly articulated by the Pay the Grants Coalition, which included a range of trade unions and NGOs and social movement actors, which called attention to the insufficiency of existing social supports in a context of widespread unemployment. Fourth were a series of public debates about the morality of cash transfers. So you had business claiming that CERB was overly generous, causing labor shortages, particularly in low-wage and retail sectors. The media regularly ran stories about CERB fraud and abuse of funds. And while the South African case is different, the specter of welfare dependency has historically hamstrung efforts to expand protections, with employment still being seen as the primary tool to address poverty. Fifth were concerns about the gender responsiveness of support. So CERB was intended to help people care for family members. It appears that this was disproportionately women who left the labor force to do so. In South Africa, child grants were increased. Most of these were paid to women, but then they would not be able to qualify for the COVID grant. Finally, in many cases, state supports were simply inadequate. And so what we saw was the emergence at multiple levels of income and livelihood support at the neighborhood and community scale. So what Ferguson would call acts of distributive labor. This included the work of NGOs, religious organizations, who were in many cases arguably more successful at delivering food and support than the state. In the North, we see the emergence of mutual aid networks at the city and community level. So in both contexts, we see remarkably similar claims, contestations, and debates around the expansion of the welfare state during the pandemic. As Ferguson would put it, these interventions were not just policy responses, they provided opportunities for a range of groups to highlight the limitations of existing supports and call for structural changes. So another example would be the way in which the specter of a wealth tax is being put on the table again in both contexts. The pandemic is perhaps best understood using Stuart Hall's notion of the conjuncture as multiple forms of political, economic, and ecological crises interact with uncertain outcomes. Even as the pandemic has provided multiple opportunities to advance distributional politics, it's also faced with counterattacks by the usual forces of capital and neoliberal austerity. And I think it's here that Ferguson's distributional politics has some limitations. Transfers have been successful in many countries at alleviating chronic poverty and dealing with livelihood crises, but they have done little to challenge inequality, particularly in the case of South Africa, which has had transfers since the late 1990s, but remains a highly unequal society. The expansion of transfers has not heralded a sustained post-neoliberal moment. Rather, we've seen the resurgence in many countries that have cash transfer programs of far-right populism. I'm thinking of Brazil and Turkey, among others. The creation of welfare states has typically entailed long waves of worker organizing and mobilization, which has advanced multiple forms of decommodification, not only in relation to work, but other aspects of social life. So I'll just wrap up here. Any effective and progressive distributional politics worth its salt would advance decommodification on multiple fronts, with expanded social protections being but one of the frontiers to challenge capital. And finally, I just want to say that it's important for critical social scientists to not treat the pandemic as yet another opportunity to gather data on marginality. Rather, what I propose in the piece is that we examine how poor communities, workers, and their organizations responded to this dramatic expansion of welfare supports and the mobilizations and contestations that have emerged from this. And I think doing so will provide us with a better understanding of the models of distribution and livelihoods on multiple scales, and the political formations, identities, and demands that can emerge from this moment. And I'm sorry for going a little bit.